You don't have to send a text. You don't have to make a call. You don't even have to speak. The most powerful response you can ever give someone who has taken your presence for granted is complete emotional detachment. Detachment is not about being cold or careless. It's about recognizing your worth to such a degree that you no longer hand it over in exchange for breadcrumbs of attention. When you master the art of detachment, you begin to realize that silence isn't empty. It's full of the answers you were too afraid to hear. It is in the quiet that your value multiplies. While they expect a reaction, you offer nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not desperation. Just peace. Just absence. And that silence becomes the loudest scream you could ever deliver. When someone mistreats you, ignores you, plays with your emotions, or manipulates your kindness, the automatic human instinct is to respond, to chase, to fix it. But that instinct is rooted in fear, the fear of loss, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of abandonment. What if, instead of reacting, you responded with nothing? That nothingness is not emptiness, it is strength. Because to not react when everything inside of you wants to is a discipline, and discipline is power. The one who controls their emotions holds the real power in any interaction. When you detach, you shift the balance. You stop playing by their rules. And suddenly, the game isn't fun anymore for them because you're no longer participating. Most people expect a response. They thrive on the push and pull, the chase, the emotional chaos. But when you don't call back, when you don't reply to that vague message, when you don't take the bait, you change the narrative. You're no longer the predictable player in their drama. You become an anomaly, a question mark, a silent force that unsettles them. That kind of silence doesn't go unnoticed. It lingers in the mind of the one who thought you'd always be available. It forces them to think, really think, about what they lost, what they ignored, what they dismissed as replaceable. And it eats away at them. Because your absence becomes their mirror. And if you were once someone who gave too much, loved too deeply, or tolerated too long, your sudden detachment will feel like a storm to them, a storm they didn't see coming, a storm they can't control. When you detach, you stop looking outward for peace and start cultivating it within. You begin to understand that no text, no call, no explanation can ever substitute for inner stillness. You are not abandoning the other person. You are returning to yourself. The energy you once used to fix, to chase, to please is now redirected toward healing, growing, evolving. And the moment you stop giving, those who took you for granted start to notice your absence like a missing rhythm in a familiar song. It doesn't sound the same without you. And they begin to feel the weight of your silence. Understand this. People don't miss you when you're constantly available. They miss you when you remove your presence from their world, without notice, without drama, without begging. That kind of disappearance shakes them. Not because you left in anger, but because you left with peace. That peace disrupts them. Because now they're not sure where you stand, how you feel, or what you're thinking. That uncertainty breeds curiosity. That curiosity breeds discomfort. That discomfort, that's power. Not the kind that tries to control, but the kind that liberates you from ever needing to prove yourself again. You don't have to block them, argue with them, or write long paragraphs explaining yourself. You don't even need closure, because detachment is closure. It's the ultimate declaration that you no longer need someone to validate your emotions. It's a statement that says, I choose me now. And when you make that choice, you raise your frequency, you shift your identity, you step out of victimhood and into sovereignty. Now, you're no longer the one waiting by the phone. You're not refreshing the inbox. You're not questioning your worth. You've risen above the emotional noise, and that silence becomes your... What most people don't understand is that detachment doesn't require anger. It requires clarity. The moment you realize someone isn't capable of loving you the way you need, you stop demanding what they can't give. You release them, not to punish them, but to preserve your spirit. You no longer invest in conversations that go nowhere. You stop explaining your value to someone who saw it and chose to ignore it. And in that decision, you don't become bitter. You become better. Your silence becomes a signal, not of defeat, but of elevation. You are no longer available for confusion. You are no longer an option on their list. You are the door they didn't think would close, now sealed shut with dignity. This is not about playing games. This is about changing your standard. This is about honoring your energy, your time, your peace. When you detach, you're not running away from love. You're running toward it, starting with yourself. Because the moment you stop begging for connection, the universe begins to echo back your power. You become magnetic. Not because you chased, but because you stood still in your truth. And that stillness, that silence, that absence, it becomes unforgettable. Silence has a language of its own. It speaks not to the ears, but to the subconscious. And while most people underestimate the impact of not saying anything, those who understand energy know that silence is louder than any shouted words. When you choose not to send a text, not to make a call, not to explain yourself, you're not just ignoring someone. You're transmitting a signal that goes deeper than logic. It unsettles, it disrupts. It forces the other person to sit with themselves. And in that stillness, they begin to feel the void that your voice used to fill. What they once took for granted now becomes noticeable by its absence, and that absence begins to echo louder with every passing hour. The subconscious mind is always listening. It picks up on patterns, energy shifts, and unspoken cues. When you go silent, especially after being emotionally available, you introduce a rupture in that subconscious rhythm. He doesn't consciously understand what's happening at first, but his instincts begin to flare. The same person who once delayed replying to your messages will now find himself checking his phone more frequently. Why hasn't she reached out? What happened? Is she upset? Is she talking to someone else? These thoughts don't come because of what you said. They come because of what you didn't say. That's how powerful your silence becomes. It invites questions his mind cannot answer. Silence forces introspection. And most people are uncomfortable with silence because it leaves them face to face with their own behavior. Without distractions, without noise, without your validation, they begin to spiral within. If he was used to you always making the effort, initiating conversations, softening conflicts, then your sudden quiet becomes a mirror. And that mirror reflects his actions or his lack of them. You're not doing it to manipulate him. You're not doing it to get revenge. You're simply allowing him to meet himself in the stillness. And that is often more disturbing than any argument or confrontation. When you withhold your words, you give him space to feel the full weight of your absence. Not because you're punishing him, but because you're finally prioritizing your own energy. Your silence, especially after emotional investment, is not empty. It's loaded with memory, emotion, and consequence. He begins to replay past conversations in his mind. He wonders if he said something wrong. He rereads old texts, looking for signs he missed. He tries to justify your silence, but nothing adds up. The longer you remain quiet, the louder your presence becomes in his psyche. This is the paradox. When you were available, he didn't notice your effort. But now that you're silent, he notices everything. Silence taps into the emotional memory center of the brain. It's not just about you not speaking, it's about the shift in energy. Where there was once laughter, warmth, and attention, there is now a space he cannot fill with noise or distractions. That space becomes a question mark he's desperate to answer. What changed? Why did she stop? Is she gone for good? The mind hates uncertainty. The ego hates silence. And together, they create a storm of restlessness within him. He begins to imagine scenarios, some real, some exaggerated, and that's when he starts to lose his grip, not because of what you've done, but because of what you've stopped doing. You see, people become addicted to energy before they ever admit it. He might not have thanked you for your time, your kindness, or your support, but he consumed it. He relied on it. Even in his inconsistency, he expected your consistency. And when that rhythm breaks, when you pull back without a word, his subconscious senses abandonment. But this is an abandonment rooted in cruelty. It's distance rooted in clarity. You're no longer feeding the dynamic that drained you. You're no longer providing emotional nourishment where there was no appreciation. And that void becomes a vacuum in his soul. It's not about silence for the sake of silence. It's about what your silence represents. It signals emotional maturity. It shows that you are no longer willing to engage on a level beneath your worth. It tells him that you are no longer available for confusion, mixed signals, or half-hearted effort. That awareness seeps into his subconscious long before he can admit it to himself. And because the subconscious mind operates through emotion, not logic, your silence creates a lingering feeling he can't shake. He starts to miss things he never acknowledged when they were right in front of him. He remembers the sound of your laugh, the way you listened, the way you gave without asking for anything in return. And now, with nothing to replace those experiences, the silence becomes deafening. You didn't block him. You didn't send an angry message. You didn't beg or plead or demand closure. You simply stopped. That stillness disrupts his inner world more than any storm you could have created. Because now, there's no resolution, only reflection. And while words can be defended, debated, and denied, silence cannot be dismissed. It stays, it lingers, it leaves a mark. And long after the noise of other conversations fades, your silence will continue speaking to his subconscious. Every time he reaches for his phone and sees nothing from you, that silence will ask a question his ego can't answer. Every quiet moment in his day will be a reminder that someone who once poured into him has turned inward. And that internal dissonance, that lack of closure, that invisible distance, it's what will cause him to lose his mind. People often misunderstand what self-respect truly is. It's not about being loud. It's not about making declarations or demanding someone recognize your worth. True self-respect is quiet. It's internal. It's a decision you make with yourself that says, I will no longer tolerate what dishonors me. And once that decision is made, everything begins to shift. You don't have to announce it. You don't have to prove anything. Your energy changes. And that change sends a signal louder than any spoken word. When you stop texting, stop calling, stop chasing, what you're really doing is honoring your value. And that honor creates a presence of power that shakes the ground beneath someone who once took you for granted. When a person gets used to your constant availability, they unconsciously assume that your presence is permanent. They stop valuing the effort you put in, the time you gave, the emotional energy you invested. You become a fixture in their world, not because they cherish you, but because they expect you. And that expectation kills appreciation. So when you finally pull back, not out of anger, but out of self-respect, it disrupts the balance they relied on. Suddenly, the comfort of your energy disappears. Suddenly, they're left with themselves. And what they begin to feel isn't your absence, it's the weight of their own lack. Self-respect doesn't scream. It doesn't plead. It doesn't beg someone to understand. It walks away with its head high and its heart intact. It doesn't engage in drama. It doesn't try to fix what refuses to grow. It doesn't wait for change. It becomes the change. And when someone has been feeding off your emotional generosity, your quiet exit becomes a powerful force they can't ignore. The mind tries to rationalize, but the heart feels the difference. Something that was once warm is now gone. And that void creates a silence so loud that it becomes unbearable. You haven't said a word, but your self-respect is now having the conversation for you. You see, people recognize your worth most clearly in your absence. When you were there, they were blind to your presence. But now, in the silence, they begin to remember. Not just what you did, but how it made them feel. They start to understand the comfort you brought, the safety, the patience, the kindness. And more importantly, they realize they never truly match that energy. It's not guilt that eats at them. It's the realization that they were given something rare and they didn't rise to meet it. That's the weight self-respect leaves behind. It doesn't throw blame. It simply walks away and lets the truth reveal itself. Most people are not used to being held accountable by silence. They're used to noise, arguments, explanations, emotional reactions. But when you go quiet, when you retreat into your own space, it forces them to confront themselves. And that confrontation is often brutal because it reveals not just what they lost, but why they lost it. Your self-respect is now a mirror showing them their emotional immaturity, their inconsistency, their lack of presence. And because ego cannot bear that truth, it begins to panic. That panic shows up in overthinking, restlessness, even regret. They may not show it outwardly, but internally, they are being pulled apart by the absence of what they never learned to appreciate. To respect yourself means to place your emotional well-being above the need for someone else's approval. It means understanding that silence is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is strength under control. It is knowing when to speak and when to retreat. It is understanding that real value doesn't chase validation. It holds its ground and lets others rise to meet it or lose the chance forever. When you make that shift, the energy you carry changes. You become more centered, more clear, more powerful. Not because you're doing anything outwardly different, but because inwardly you've aligned with your own truth. That alignment becomes magnetic. It draws in what's meant for you and repels what isn't. And for the person who expected you to always be there, that magnetism becomes confusing. How can she be so calm? Why isn't she reaching out? Who is she talking to? Why does it feel like I'm the one who lost something valuable? These questions haunt the mind that once overlooked you. Not because you intended to hurt them, but because you finally chose to heal yourself. Your healing created space. That space is what drives them into confusion. And confusion becomes a storm when it's rooted in ego. Self-respect creates boundaries without bitterness. You're not closing your heart, you're protecting it. You're not playing games, you're elevating your standards. And that shift changes the emotional landscape. You no longer participate in dynamics that drain you. You no longer explain your worth to people who refuse to see it. You no longer beg for attention. You simply exist in your truth. And your silence becomes the proof. The longer you stay in that energy, the more it affects those around you. Some will grow and meet you there. Others will crumble under the weight of their own avoidance. But you remain grounded. You remain clear. And your self-respect, without saying a word, rewrites the story completely. When you remove your attention from someone who was used to receiving it constantly, something fascinating happens. They begin to feel it. Not just in passing, not just with curiosity, but with intensity. Attention, especially from someone who genuinely cares, is energy. It is nourishment to the ego, fuel to the identity, and comfort to the soul. When you withdraw that energy, when you stop feeding their need for constant validation, communication, or reassurance, it causes an energetic vacuum. The silence becomes a weight. The absence becomes a mirror. And suddenly the person who felt secure in your presence begins to unravel in your absence. Most people are not aware of how much they depend on your energy until it's no longer there. Your texts, your calls, your emotional check-ins, all of that was oxygen. When you go quiet, they start gasping. But it's not because they miss you in the way you might think. It's because they were relying on the version of themselves they became when they had your attention. You see, when you are constantly reaching out, they don't have to reach in. They don't have to question themselves. They don't have to work for your affection. They don't have to feel the sting of consequence. But when you stop texting, stop calling, stop chasing, you are no longer enabling their emotional laziness. You are no longer the constant reminder that says, you're important, even if you don't act like it. This withdrawal hits deeper than any argument could. Arguments can be brushed off, words can be ignored, but silence speaks to the soul. And the louder your silence, the more desperate their internal dialogue becomes. They wonder why you're no longer available. They replay the last conversation. They scroll through old texts. They analyze your social media. They create entire stories in their head, trying to fill the gap that your attention once filled so effortlessly. And all of this mental chaos is triggered by your decision to stop feeding the dynamic. Your withdrawal becomes a catalyst for their discomfort. But this is not about revenge. It's about balance. It's about reclaiming your emotional power and refusing to pour into a cup that's full of holes. You're not withholding attention to hurt anyone. You're doing it to preserve your energy, to regain clarity, to prioritize your peace. Because when your attention is not respected, it becomes a burden. It becomes a performance. And no one should have to perform for love. Love should be reciprocal. Interest should be mutual. Effort should be shared. When it's not, the wisest thing you can do is remove your energy and observe. Observe what happens in the space you once filled. Observe how quickly someone notices what they never truly valued, and they will notice. Maybe not instantly, maybe not in a dramatic display, but they will feel it. Some may respond with silence of their own, thinking it's a game. Others may act out, trying to provoke a reaction. But the ones who truly felt something for you, even if they never admitted it, will be left with a deep sense of confusion. Because people expect closure. They expect explanations. They expect you to reach out and resolve the tension. But when you don't, when you allow the silence to stretch out like a mirror reflecting everything they avoided, it drives them into self-reflection. That reflection is not always pretty. It brings up questions. They don't want to answer. Was I selfish? Did I take her for granted? Why didn't I try harder? These questions are internal daggers, slow and steady. They realize you're not just ignoring them, you're healing, you're evolving, you're detaching. And that detachment isn't passive, it's powerful. It creates a new energetic landscape where they are no longer the center. They are no longer in control. They are no longer the receiver of your emotional investment. And that shift threatens their identity, especially if they were used to being the one pursued. The beauty of energetic detachment is that you don't have to do anything dramatic. You don't have to block, unfollow, or post anything cryptic. You simply remove your presence. You stop sending energy in their direction. And because you once gave so much, the absence feels like punishment, even though it's simply peace. Your peace unsettles them. Your peace becomes suspicious. Your peace becomes louder than anything you ever said. Because in that peace is a statement, I no longer need you to be okay. The mind of the person who lost your energy starts searching for cracks in their logic. They try to reframe the story, try to convince themselves it was mutual, that they also pull back. But the heart knows. The heart knows who showed up and who didn't. The heart knows who reached out and who ignored. The heart knows who stayed consistent and who disappeared. And that knowing creates a dissonance inside them that they cannot escape. They begin to crave your attention not just for comfort, but to silence that internal voice that's now screaming truth. Energetic detachment, when done with clarity and peace, becomes the most powerful shift you can make. It requires no announcement. It doesn't need to be broadcast. It simply is. You go silent, not because you're weak, but because you're strong enough to stop chasing what isn't chasing you. You stop feeding what isn't feeding you. You choose yourself, and in doing so, you send a shockwave through the dynamic that forces them to feel the full weight of their actions, or lack thereof. There is an invisible power that awakens when you go silent. Not the kind of silence that stems from bitterness or passive aggression, but the silence that rises from clarity, strength, and deep emotional maturity. When you stop talking, stop texting, stop calling, and instead focus on your inner healing, you are engaging in one of the most transformative acts of self-respect. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't broadcast itself to the world. It doesn't seek validation or applause. It moves in quiet, intentional steps that most people will never see. But make no mistake, when you begin to heal in silence, everything about you changes. Not in a superficial way, but at the core level of your being. Healing requires attention, your own attention. And when you've spent weeks, months, or even years giving that attention to someone else, investing emotionally, mentally, energetically, it becomes necessary to redirect that same force inward. That means no longer explaining yourself to people who never listened. That means you stop chasing after clarity from someone who refused to give it when you needed it most. That means you pull away, not because you're angry, but because you finally understand that continuing to pour into a space that gives you nothing in return is the fastest way to lose yourself. Silence is not absence. It is alignment. It is the state where your soul begins to speak louder than your ego. Healing in silence looks like choosing peace over chaos, choosing stillness over noise, choosing presence over pursuit. It means walking through your pain without trying to distract yourself with drama, without looking for temporary fixes like late night texts or accidental encounters. When you heal in silence, you start to notice the patterns, the way you tolerated things that weren't worthy of your spirit, the way you confuse emotional intensity with connection, the way you gave the best of you to someone who barely gave you consistency. And in that awareness, the healing deepens. People think healing is about forgetting someone, but it's not. It's about remembering who you were before you made them so important. It's about reintroducing yourself to the version of you that didn't rely on another person's behavior to feel worthy, to feel seen, to feel loved. Silence gives you the space to do that. It pulls you out of the noise of reaction and into the clarity of reflection. And in that clarity, you begin to ask yourself different questions. Not why did they leave, but why did I stay so long? Not how could they hurt me, but why didn't I protect my peace sooner? The beauty of silent healing is that it doesn't require anyone else's participation. You don't need an apology. You don't need closure. You don't need them to understand your worth. You already know what they didn't see. You already feel the shift. You know that every time you choose not to reach out, you're building strength. Every time you resist the urge to check their page, you're reclaiming your attention. Every time you stop yourself from rewriting the past in your head, you're stepping forward. These moments don't feel dramatic, but they are monumental. They are the quiet revolutions that rebuild the foundation of your self-worth. And what happens when you begin to heal in silence is that you stop being emotionally available to the people who drained you. They can sense it, even if you don't say a word. They feel the detachment in your lack of urgency, your lack of reaction, your lack of need. It unsettles them because they were used to your patterns. They expected you to come running, to check in, to fix what they broke. But when your silence speaks louder than any confrontation, they begin to realize that access to you was a privilege and it's been revoked. What you do in silence becomes your preparation ground. This is where you reset your nervous system. You ground yourself again, you read, you journal, you walk, you reflect, you reimagine your life without the weight of emotional confusion. You start aligning with the kind of energy that doesn't beg to be loved, but knows it already is. You start setting boundaries that don't require explanation. You give yourself permission to evolve without guilt. You develop a deeper relationship with yourself, one rooted not in external approval, but internal validation. This transformation cannot be forced. It must be allowed. And silence is the environment where it can unfold organically. When no one is watching, no one is liking, no one is validating, that is when your growth becomes real. That is when your resilience is built, not to impress others, but to restore you. You don't need to post about your progress. You don't need to announce that you're healing. The energy speaks for itself. You become calmer. Your standards rise. Your responses slow down. Your decisions sharpen. You become more selective, not out of fear, but out of discernment. You no longer chase attention. You magnetize it through the calm, grounded energy that your silence cultivated. Healing in silence doesn't mean you're closed off. It means you're filtering what deserves access. It means you stop running after answers and started listening to the wisdom already within you. That wisdom tells you that your worth was never tied to someone else's ability to recognize it. That wisdom shows you that peace is not something you find in another person. It's something you return to within yourself. The deeper you heal, the less you feel the need to convince, explain, or prove anything to anyone. You simply exist as the healed version of yourself. And that existence becomes the most powerful message you could ever send. When you stop chasing, you start attracting. That truth sounds simple, but is rooted in deep spiritual and psychological law. The moment you withdraw your energy from someone who once thrived on your presence, your texts, your affection, and your emotional investment, something powerful begins to happen. The dynamic shifts not because you're playing a game, but because you've reclaimed control over your emotional frequency. You're no longer operating from a place of lack, need, or desperation. You're vibrating from fullness, clarity, and quiet confidence. And that change doesn't go unnoticed. It radiates, it penetrates, it stirs something deep in the person who once took your attention for granted. You see, we often confuse connection with attachment. When you're attached, you're reaching, pulling, grasping. You're hoping they'll reply, hoping they'll see your worth, hoping they'll miss you. But when you release that attachment, when you stop trying to prove your value, instead rest in the certainty that you are valuable, everything around you shifts. Energy doesn't lie. People can feel when your spirit detaches. They may not understand it consciously, but subconsciously, they sense a disconnection they can't control, and it drives them mad. Why? Because they lost their emotional supply. The attention, the validation, the consistent energy you gave, without question. You didn't need to say a word. No angry texts, no dramatic exits, no long emotional paragraphs. Just your silence. Your absence. And in that absence, they meet themselves. They face the echo of their choices. They start wondering where your energy went, why you stopped trying, why you no longer reach out. And the more they wonder, the more they spiral, because silence creates a void. And that void makes space for realization to emerge. Suddenly, the messages you sent, the effort you gave, the loyalty you showed, everything they dismissed as normal becomes significant in its absence. When you pull back your energy, you're not punishing them. You're honoring you. You're communicating something loud and clear without uttering a single word. My peace is not negotiable. And when that boundary is felt rather than spoken, it becomes more powerful. They realize they can no longer control the flow of your attention. They can no longer predict your next move. That unpredictability is what makes you magnetic. Not because you're trying to manipulate, but because you've become self-sufficient. You've stopped orbiting around their approval and started walking in your own gravity. Attraction works on the principle of polarity. The more you chase, the more the other pulls away. But when you stand still, when you become grounded in your own energy, you become a force. You attract effortlessly, not because you're trying to be noticed, but because you've become so focused on your own path that people start to crave your presence. Especially the one who thought you'd never leave. Especially the one who thought you'd always be available. Your silence becomes a mirror reflecting everything they failed to value. This doesn't just affect them emotionally, disrupts their patterns. They start to feel a loss of control, and that loss is unnerving. They'll try to make sense of it. They'll test the waters with little gestures, subtle likes, breadcrumb texts, random check-ins. Not because they're ready to step up, but because they want to see if the door is still open. But you're not the same anymore. You're not reacting. You're not reaching. You're not falling for emotional crumbs. You're in a different space. one of power, presence, and peace. You see, most people expect you to fold. They expect you to cave in, to send that late night text to show them that they still matter. But when you don't, when you stay grounded in your silence and continue focusing on your healing, they begin to panic. Not because they miss you per se, but because they miss the version of themselves that existed in your presence. You made them feel important. You gave them a safe space. You provided emotional oxygen. And now they're gasping for air. This internal tension doesn't resolve easily for them. It lingers, it festers, it builds, because they start to realize something deeper. Your energy was rare. Your loyalty wasn't standard. Your kindness, your patience, your willingness to understand, that wasn't just a phase, that was you. And now that energy is no longer accessible. That's when the regret creeps in. That's when the loss becomes real. Because they thought you'd always be there, they counted on it. And now they're dealing with the consequences of taking something valuable for granted. You don't have to announce your worth. You don't have to shout that you're done. You don't need a revenge glow up or an elaborate post about your growth. The most powerful statement is made in your stillness. It's in the way you move differently, the way you no longer engage in the same loops, the way you're emotionally unavailable, not out of pain, but out of purpose. That change is undeniable. That change is what drives them to a place of confusion and obsession. Because deep down, they know they lost something they may never find again. And here's the final truth about attraction. What you chase flees, and what you allow flows. You've become the flow. You're no longer asking, pleading, or waiting. You're receiving. You're watching everything that belongs to you rise to meet you, and everything that doesn't fall away on its own. That person will feel the shift long before they understand it. They'll wonder why nothing feels the same, why other people can't match the energy you gave so naturally. But by then, you'll be so deep into your journey, so aligned with your value, that their confusion won't faze you. You'll feel no need to respond, to explain, or to prove anything, because your silence already did